Along Crazy Woman Creek, the cottonwoods had gone to bone. The air bit the lungs and tasted of iron and distance. Ice sealed the creek edges in a skin that thickened each morning, and the wind came off the basin steady and flat. The kind of wind that does not gust because it does not need to. It simply leans against everything and waits. In the shallow cut below the bank, a young woman knelt in frozen mud, packing gray clay into the joints between flat stones with the back of a spoon. Her hands were cracked to the knuckles. Her breath came in short, white pulls. Beside her, a pile of brush too small to deserve the name, a few days of burning, no more, sat against a wall that did not meet its neighbor. Clarabelle Mercer had been in Buffalo, Wyoming territory for 11 weeks when the last store closed. She had arrived in September with a trunk, a bedding roll, $7.40, and no one waiting for her. She had come west from Omaha by way of Cheyenne on a freight wagon that charged her $2 for the privilege of sitting on sacked oats for 9 days. Her father, Jonah Mercer, had repaired kilns, bake ovens, and freight company chimneys in river towns along the Missouri until a beam fell on his chest in a warehouse collapse and killed him. Her mother had died 2 winters before that, coughing blood into a basin until the basin was not enough, and they used a bucket. Clara was 19 years old. The only trade she carried was the ability to mend shirts, copy ledger figures in a clean hand, and remember things her father had taught her about the behavior of heat in fired clay and stone. She found work at Mrs. Penrose's boarding house in Buffalo, mending, laundering, copying supply list for a cot in the back hallway and meals she ate standing up near the kitchen door. It was not a life. It was a foothold. 11 weeks of standing on that foothold taught her the rhythm of the place. Cattle money flowed through Buffalo like creek water, fast and loud, and not for her. The men who stayed at Penrose were freight brokers, cattle buyers, land agents. They left coins on the table and expected the girl with the needle to be invisible when she was not useful. The foothold held until the night a married freight broker named Dawson cornered her in the storeroom behind the kitchen. He smelled of whiskey and tallow. He put his hand on her arm and his shoulder against the door frame so she could not pass. Clara slapped him hard enough that 3 men in the dining room heard the crack through the wall. Dawson stumbled backward into a shelf of tinned peaches. 2 cans hit the floor. Clara walked out through the kitchen without running. Dawson did not press charges. He did not need to. By the next afternoon, Mrs. Penrose told Clara she could not keep a girl who caused scenes. The livery where Clara had occasionally earned a dime brushing harness refused her at the door. The dry goods clerk who had let her sweep for credit said his wife preferred she not come back. The seamstress who sometimes passed along piecework said nothing at all, just shook her head and closed the curtain. Nobody called it punishment. Nobody used the word expelled. The town simply closed, the way a hand closes around something it means to crush. And Clara stood outside it with her trunk and her sewing basket and a government envelope that held her father's last pension notice, worth nothing now except the habit of carrying it. The deputy, Amos Reed, found her behind the stable at dusk. She was sitting on her trunk with the sewing basket balanced on the lid and sleet just beginning to tick against the leather. Reed was not a cruel man. He had a daughter near Clara's age back in Laramie. He shifted his weight on the frozen ground and looked at the iron latch on the stable door rather than at her face because looking at her face made the thing he had to say worse. He told her the landlady would not house her past nightfall. He said it in the voice of a man delivering a verdict he had not written. Reed asked quietly, "Miss Mercer, where exactly do you mean to go?" Clara looked at him. Then she looked past him, toward the black line of fenced range that ran south and west into darkness. She did not answer. She stood, picked up a broken half-brick from the stable yard, brushed the frost off its face, and put it in her trunk. Reed watched her do it. A stable boy, 14, skinny, standing in the doorway with a bridle in his hand, watched her do it too. Neither of them understood why a girl being thrown out of the last warm place she could stand would stop to pick up a broken brick. But she closed the trunk lid over it and lifted the handle and walked south into the dark. That night, she walked. The strip of ground Clara found was not land she owned or leased or had been offered. It was land nobody wanted. It sat on the west edge of Crazy Woman Creek, where the Crescent Bar Ranch fence ran close to a shallow cut in the bank. The cut offered 3 sides of raw earth and a partial windbreak of dead cottonwood that rattled in the gusts like dry bones. Someone had started a lean-to here once, scrap boards nailed crooked to leaning posts, a half frame of roof poles with gaps wide enough to put a fist through, a pile of stiff hides and a rusted bucket. It had been abandoned the way small failures are abandoned on the open range, without ceremony, without burial, without anyone remembering why it was started. The walls did not meet. The roof did not exist above the back third. The ground inside was frozen mud, stone, and the kind of silence that sounds like the land has already decided what happens next. Clara set her trunk against the sturdiest wall and did not unpack. She stood in the cut with her arms wrapped around her ribs and counted what she had. 2 dresses, 1 calico, 1 wool, both mended at the elbows, 1 wool petticoat, a bedding roll that smelled of horse sweat and old flour sacking, her father's folding rule, brass hinged and scratched from 1,000 measurements, an awl, a chalk line, a spoon, a tin cup with a dent in the rim, a sewing kit with 6 needles, 3 spools of thread, and a thimble she had worn smooth, $7.40 in mixed coin. Flour enough for 6 days if she ate small, salt pork for 3, coffee for maybe a week if she brewed it so weak it barely colored the water, and 1/2 brick, broken on the diagonal, that she had carried from the stable yard in Buffalo because something in her bones said that a thing which holds heat is worth carrying, even when you cannot yet say why. She did not have an axe. She did not have a stove. She did not have a single cord of firewood, and the willow brush and broken sage roots piled near the cut would not fill a wheelbarrow, let alone carry her through a week of burning. She did not have a horse, a mule, a neighbor who owed her kindness, or a road back to anywhere that would take her in. The nearest ranch house, the Crescent Bar, sat more than a mile east across open grass. The nearest reliable help sat nowhere she could name. Buffalo was 8 miles north by the track, maybe 10 by the way she had walked in the dark. The town did not want her. The range did not know her. Winter on the northern plains of Wyoming Territory was not a season that bargained or waited. It arrived on its own schedule, and its schedule in the Powder River Basin in late 1886 was already running ahead of anyone's comfort. She could not afford passage east. She had no kin to claim, and once the road sealed under drifting snow and wind hard enough to strip the sight from your eyes, walking away from this place became another word for dying on the way to somewhere else. Clara knelt beside the brush pile, struck a match, and fed a handful of sage twigs into a flame that smoked and spit and threw more ash than warmth. She crouched over it with her hands out, feeling heat that would be gone in an hour. She had perhaps 2 weeks before sustained severe weather, perhaps 3 if luck held, perhaps less if it did not. The numbers did not work. They had not worked from the beginning. They were the kind of numbers that belonged on a headstone. Silas Hume arrived on the 3rd morning. He came on a dun horse with a rifle across his saddle and a face the wind had carved into something that looked like it had been angry for so long it had forgotten what came before anger. He was 62 years old. He had been line camp foreman for the Crescent Bar for 9 years and had ridden for 3 outfits before that. He did not ride the fence because Elias Rourke told him to. He rode it because fence was the difference between order and chaos on open range, and Silas Hume did not believe in chaos. He had seen the smoke, a thin, pitiful thread rising from the creek cut, barely enough to mark a campfire, certainly not enough to mean a working stove. He came to see who was burning on Rourke's edge, and whether the burning was a trespass that required words or a problem that would resolve itself. He did not dismount. He sat the dun horse and looked at the lean-to from above, the way a man looks at a body before anyone has confirmed it is dead. He studied the half-frame walls, the gapped roof, the pile of brush, the trunk, the girl standing in front of her scrapboard wall with soot on her hands, and her jaw set against something she was not willing to name. Clara did not ask him who he was. She did not ask him for anything. Silas noticed that first. In his experience, people in desperate positions either begged or lied. This girl did neither. She stood still and waited for him to declare his purpose. He swung down, looped his reins on a cottonwood branch, and walked the shelter without permission. He pressed his palm flat against the wall where the boards did not meet and felt the wind come through the gap. He kicked the base of the nearest corner post and watched it shift in the frozen ground, 2 inches of play, maybe 3. He crouched beside the brush pile and measured its volume against his handspan, his lips moving as he calculated burn time. Then he walked the perimeter, noting where the sod banking was missing, where the roof poles sagged, where snow would drift first. He came back and stood in front of Clara with his hands on his belt. Silas said, "You have half a frame. You have maybe 1.5 cords of fuel, if you call that pile fuel, which I would not. You need a tight roof, you need walls that meet at the corners, you need sod banking to the eaves, and you need 6 cords minimum, split, stacked, and dry, to write out what is coming. You do not have any of these things." Clara said, "I know what I do not have." Silas said, "You know the count, or you know the consequence? Because they are not the same thing." Clara did not answer. Silas said, "Cold does not negotiate. I have seen it take a man in a line camp with 4 cords stacked and a good stove because the stovepipe cracked at 2 in the morning and he could not fix it with frozen hands. I have seen a family of 5 burn everything they owned, chairs, table, door frame, and still lose a child before dawn. You are alone. You have no stove. You have no timber supply and no way to haul one. You don't die because fire fails, miss. You die because cold gets in faster than you can feed it. That is arithmetic, not opinion." He let the words sit. Wind pushed through the gap in the wall and stirred the ash of Clara's dead fire. Silas said, "Ranches out here sit miles apart. Nobody rides through a norther to check on a stranger. The cattle boom filled this basin with outfits and big talk, but the same system that drives the beef price does not stockpile kindness for people who fall outside it. If you have people somewhere, anywhere, write to them now, today. Do not wait for December." Clara said, "I do not have people somewhere." Silas looked at her for a long time. Then he mounted the dun horse, pulled his hat brim against the wind, and rode east along the fence line without looking back. He did not offer food. He did not offer shelter. He was not heartless. He was a man who had spent 4 decades watching the territory sort people into the living and the dead, and he had stopped pretending the sorting was something he could change. That night, the temperature dropped hard enough to freeze the creek edge 2 inches thick. Clara fed her brush pile into a fire that burned for barely 2 hours and gave back heat she could feel only if she held her hands directly over the flame. By midnight, the fire was ash. By 1 in the morning, she was shaking inside her bedding roll on frozen ground, her teeth hitting together in a rhythm she could not control. She counted the math again because counting was the only thing she could do in the dark. 6 days of flour, 3 of pork, no fuel that mattered. 8 miles to a town that did not want her, a shelter that was not a shelter, a body that was already spending more heat than it could make. But Clara did not think about wood. She thought about brick. She thought about a collapsed bread oven in a river town when she was 9, and her father crouching beside it with soot under his thumbnail and lime dust floating in the late afternoon light. She thought about his hand closing over hers and pressing her palm against clay that was warm, warm hours after the last flame had died, and his voice saying the things she had carried further than anything else he ever gave her. Slow is how you win winter. She did not have a plan. She had a memory, and the memory held warmth the way fired clay holds warmth, deep, quiet, and longer than anyone expects. The idea arrived in pieces. 4 days after Silas Hume's visit, Clara walked the creek bank looking for anything that burned longer than sage. She found willow stubs, a few handfuls of dried cottonwood bark, and nothing that would sustain a fire through a single night. But near a spot where Crescent Bar ranch hands had been dumping stove ash from the bunkhouse, the bank cut exposed a seam of yellow-gray clay, dense, smooth when she dug into it with a flat stone, heavy in her fist. It held together when she squeezed. It did not crumble. It felt like something that could be worked. She crouched there with cold clay in her right hand, and the warmth of the freshest ash pile pressing through her boot sole, and the two sensations, cold mass, warm residue, met somewhere behind her ribs where her father's voice still lived. That evening she stood at a distance from the Crescent Bar bunkhouse, not close enough to be challenged, but close enough to see through the window. The iron stove glowed red-orange while the fire raged. Men sat close to it with their boots off and their hands out. Heat filled the room like water fills a glass, fast, generous, and temporary. An hour later she walked past again. The fire had slumped. The stove was cooling from red to gray to black. The room was already losing what it had gained, the heat climbing through the shingled roof and into a sky that would never give it back. By morning, those men would feed the stove again, and the cycle would repeat, and every ounce of warmth would escape through wood and shingle and air gaps as though the fire had never burned. Air heat vanishes. Mass heat lingers. Her father had known this. Every kiln builder knew it. Every bread oven in every river town along the Missouri proved it every baking day. You fired the oven hard, you swept the coals, and then you baked for hours on the heat stored in brick and clay alone. The fire was not the point. The fire was the delivery system. The mass was the bank that held the deposit. Clara did not know the word Kang. She did not know that in northern China, families had slept on heated masonry platforms for centuries, routing the hot gases from a cook fire through channels beneath a clay bed so the mass absorbed heat and released it slowly through freezing nights. She did not need the word or the history. She knew the principle because her father had dragged a nail through damp clay to show her how smoke should travel, horizontally first, surrendering heat to the mass before rising through the flue to leave. She'd knelt beside him on a dirt floor and watched him sketch the path. She had pressed her 9-year-old hand against fired brick and felt what he meant without being able to explain it. Now she could explain it, not in a textbook, in dirt. She began to think not about a stove, which she could not buy, could not haul, and could not feed, but about a bench, a sleeping platform built of creek clay, flat stone, and salvaged brick, with channels inside it where hot smoke would travel a long, slow path before rising through a flue and leaving. An exterior firebox, small and sheltered, pushing heat through the bench from outside the lean-to wall. The fire would burn short and hot. The mass would absorb. She would sleep not next to flame, but on top of stored warmth that would radiate upward through the night. The design she scratched into frozen dirt with a stick was simple because everything she owned was simple. A bench roughly 10 feet long, 3 feet wide, about 2.5 feet high at the sleeping surface. 2 main horizontal channels running the length, connected at the far end by a turn, with a single rise into a vertical flue. The firebox positioned outside the lean-to wall, facing away from the prevailing wind, sheltered by sod and whatever scrap metal she could find. Flat stones lining the channel walls and floor. River clay packed thick, 4 inches, 5 inches, whatever she could manage, around the channels and over the top, forming the sleeping platform itself. If it worked, she could burn a fraction of the fuel a stove demanded and carry warmth through the hours when the fire was out. The arithmetic that had been impossible with open flame became possible, barely, dangerously, desperately possible with stored heat. If it failed, she would have wasted the only building days she had left. She would have spent her strength on mud while the calendar spent her time. The clay could crack in a hard freeze before curing. The channel walls could collapse under the weight of the platform stones. The smoke could refuse to draw, pooling in the channels and backing into the shelter until the air turned lethal. One poorly sealed joint between firebox and wall could fill the lean-to with carbon monoxide while she slept, and she would simply not wake up. She ran the risk against the alternative. The alternative was the arithmetic Silas Hume had spoken aloud. Cold gets in faster than you can feed it. With no stove, no timber supply, and no labor besides her own two hands, feeding the cold was a race she had already lost. The only option left was to stop racing and change the terms. Clara stood up from the dirt diagram. Her knees ached. Her hands were numb. The wind was pushing through the cottonwoods with a sound like someone tearing cloth. She walked to the clay bank and started digging. Nora Vale found her the next morning, elbow deep in creek clay, pulling fist-sized lumps and piling them on a canvas scrap she had weighted with stones. Nora was 30. She had been a widow since spring, when her husband, a small freighter who ran loads between Buffalo and the railroad towns, died of a burst appendix on the Bozeman Road, 70 miles from anyone who could have helped. She lived in a shack 2 miles south and survived by mending harness, selling eggs from 4 surviving hens, and refusing pity with enough force that people mostly stayed clear. She had heard about Clara from the talk at the store, and had come not from charity but from curiosity. She wanted to see whether the thrown-out girl was real or just a story men were telling to fill the time between whiskey and winter. She found Clara on her knees in the cut with gray clay drying on her arms to the elbows, and a look on her face that was not despair. It was something worse. It was calculation. Nora said, "They told me you were building a mud fort out here." Clara said, "It is not a fort." Nora crouched beside the clay pile and studied the flat stones Clara had begun stacking along the wash edge. She looked at the diagrams scratched into the ground, the long rectangle, the internal lines, the small square-marked firebox, the vertical mark labeled flue. Nora said, "Then what is it?" Clara told her. Not as a speech. As a woman who had been arguing with herself for 3 days and needed to hear the argument outside her own skull. A bench. Clay and stone and salvage brick if she could find it. Channels for smoke. An outside firebox. Heat that travels through mass instead of vanishing into air. Nora listened without interrupting. Then she asked her questions, and each one landed like a stone dropped into Clara's diagram. Nora said, "How will smoke know where you want it to go?" Clara picked up a stick and traced the channel path. She said the channels would slope slightly upward toward the flue rise. Hot gases climb. Give them a path and a pull, and they follow. The firebox throat would be narrow enough to push the gases through with velocity, rather than letting them pool and cool too soon. Nora said, "And what happens when the clay splits? Because clay splits. I've seen it 100 times. Clara said she would temper the mix with sand from the creek bed and dried grass chopped fine. Her father had done the same repairing kiln linings. Tempered clay shrank slower, cracked thinner, and held longer than raw mud. She would pack thick, 4 or 5 inches over the channels so that surface cracks did not reach the smoke path. Nora said, "What keeps the bench from taking all the heat and leaving you with a warm rock in a cold room?" Clara said the bench taking the heat was the entire point. She did not want a warm room. A warm room leaked warmth through every gap, every board, every inch of roof. She wanted a warm surface under her body, where the heat could not escape upward into air she could not seal. The bench was not furniture. It was the stove. Nora said, "Where do you mean to find enough stone for this without killing yourself carrying it?" Clara pointed at the creek wash. Flat stones lay in heaps where spring floods had dumped them, rough, uneven, heavy, but free and close. She had already carried 14 that morning. Her shoulders burned. Her back hurt in a place that had not hurt before this week. But the stones were there, and they did not require money. Nora stood up. She looked at Clara for a long, quiet moment. The kind of look that is not judgment and not pity, but something between the two that has no clean name. Nora said, "I think you are going to die out here." Clara wiped clay from her palms onto her wool skirt. She said, "Maybe, but not because I sat still and waited for it." Nora left, but Clara noticed she looked back twice before the trail bent south. She came back the next day, and the day after that. The mockery started before the first channel stone was laid. Elias Rourke was 31, the owner's son, and acting boss of the Crescent Bar, while his father spent winter in Cheyenne. He had grown up inside the cattle boom like a boy raised in a cathedral. He believed in its permanence the way he believed in gravity. The open range had made his family rich. The Powder River Basin was kingdom. And the idea that a discarded seamstress could squat on his fence line and survive by smearing mud on a sleeping bench was not merely ridiculous to Elias Rourke. It was an affront to the order of the world as he understood it. He noticed Clara the way a rancher notices a coyote on his wire, with irritation and the casual confidence that winter would solve the problem without requiring his effort. She occupied a strip near his fence and creek access. Her survival would embarrass him because he had already told his hand she would not last. Her failure would confirm everything he believed about the distance between cattle money and no money, between men who owned the basin and women who washed their shirts. He rode up on a Tuesday afternoon with two hands flanking him. Clara was on her knees packing the first test trench, a short channel against the lean-to wall, 4 feet long, lined with flat stones and sealed with creek clay. Her hands were gray to the wrists. Her hair was tied back with a strip of torn petticoat. She did not look up when the horses stopped. Elias leaned forward on his saddle horn and watched her. Elias said, "They told me you were building something down here. I rode over thinking they had to be wrong." Clara pressed clay into a joint between two stones and did not respond. Elias said, "You need wood, not mud. Every child on the range knows that." Clara said without raising her head, "Then it is fortunate the wood is not for the bed." One of the hands, a younger man with an embarrassed expression, laughed once and then stopped when Elias looked at him. Elias said, "What I see from this horse is a girl playing in dirt. You know what that looks like? It looks like someone building a grave and climbing in." Clara set down her spoon handle and looked at him directly for the first time. She said nothing. Her face gave him nothing. Elias waited for the argument that would let him win, and it did not come. He turned to his men. He said loudly enough that the wind would carry it, "I will wager a month's wages the town sparrow is a blue corpse by breakfast after the first real norther. Who wants the other side?" Neither hand spoke. Elias laughed. It was not a cruel laugh in the way a slap is cruel. It was the laugh of a man who has never been corrected about anything important and finds the possibility so remote that he can afford to be generous about it. He gathered his reins. He said to Clara and to the air and to the hands who would repeat it in the bunkhouse that night, "She means to sleep on a grave she built herself." They rode east along the fence. Clara watched the horses until they were small against the grass. Then she picked up the spoon handle and went back to tamping clay. At the store 2 days later, the clerk told Clara nails were cash only. She counted 11 cents onto the counter for 6 bent nails from the scrap bin and wrapped them in a rag while 2 men at the counter traded Elias's joke. One said the girl on the creek was baking herself in mud like a clay pot. The other said she had Eastern nerves and would run before the first real freeze. A ranch wife at the dry goods counter told no one in particular that encouraging vagrancy was not the same as Christian charity, and that Nora Vale ought to know the difference. None of it cost Clara food or fuel. It cost her something harder to weigh: the slow, steady pressure of being dismissed by everyone whose hands held the things she needed. Every laugh was a door clicking shut. Every joke was a reminder that the people around her had already decided the story's ending, but Clara's arithmetic had not changed. Every hour those men spent laughing was an hour she spent digging clay. Every joke about mud was a joke about something they did not understand. And the thing she could not afford, 2 cords of firewood, hauled, split, and stacked, still cost more than the thing she could pull from the creek bank with her own hands. She did not need their approval. She needed their clay, their creek stones, and 1 more week without snow. That evening, Clara lit a test fire in the short trench she had packed with clay and lined with flat stones. She fed it sage twigs and willow bark, a small, hot burn, nothing more than a double handful of fuel. The fire lasted maybe 20 minutes. The flame chewed through the dry wood and died to gray ash. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then she knelt and laid her palm on the far stone, 18 inches from where the fire had burned. Warm, not hot, not the searing warmth of a stoveplate. The deep, slow warmth of mass that has been asked to hold something and is holding it. The kind of warmth her father had pressed her hand against in the ruins of a bread oven 20 years and 1,000 miles from this creek bank. It was not survival. A test trench 4 feet long and warmed by a handful of twigs would not carry her through a January night when the air turned solid and the wind came off the basin like a blade. But it was a fact she could feel under her own skin. The heat had entered the clay, traveled through the channel, reached the far stone, and stayed. The principle worked. The physics had not changed since her father sketched a smoke path in mud with a bent nail. She pressed her hand harder against the stone, as if she could hold the warmth there by will alone. It was not enough. Not yet. But it was the difference between theory and proof, between a dead man's lesson and a living woman's foundation, and that difference was the only thing left between Clara and the verdict the cold had already written. 2 weeks. Maybe less. She had clay and stone, and a body that was burning through its own reserves faster than she could replace them. She had a memory that was holding, and she had a bench to build. She started digging the full foundation trench at first light. The ground was iron. Her hands bled where the blisters broke against the edge of a flat stone she was using as a shovel. She dug anyway. A trench 10 feet long, 3 feet wide, 18 inches deep. By noon, she had cleared 6 feet. By dusk, 8. Her shoulders felt like they had been beaten with a board. Her back locked when she tried to stand straight. She kept digging. If you have ever been told you could not survive something and decided to prove the telling wrong, stay with the story, because what Clara builds next changes everything, and what the cowboy finds inside it changes him. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been dismissed by someone who did not understand what you were building? She slept that night on frozen ground beside an open trench that smelled of turned earth and creek clay. The wind found every gap in the lean-to boards. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it in the way the moisture inside her nose froze when she breathed in. But under the canvas where she had piled the day's clay and covered it to keep it from freezing solid overnight, the mass held a ghost of warmth from the afternoon sun. She pressed her hand against it in the dark. Slow, she thought. Slow is how you win. Somewhere east, in the Crescent Bar bunkhouse, men were feeding an iron stove for the 3rd time that night. The heat was climbing through the shingle roof and vanishing into a sky that had never once given anything back. Clara closed her eyes. She had 8 feet of trench and the beginning of an answer. She had 2 weeks, maybe less, and she had not yet met the man who would teach her how to make the answer hold. The man who changed the arithmetic arrived on the 5th day of digging. Clara was standing in her trench at mid-morning, stacking flat creek stones along the channel walls, when she heard footsteps on the frozen bank above her. Not horse hooves, not the heavy boots of ranch hands. A lighter step, deliberate, the sound of a man who was used to walking where walking drew attention. She looked up. A Chinese man stood at the edge of the cut, watching her work. He was about 50, though his face made the number uncertain. Lean, deeply lined around the eyes, with hands that were scarred across the knuckles in the way hands get scarred from years of working stone and morite and hot brick. He wore a canvas coat patched at both elbows, a wool cap pulled low, and boots that had been resoled at least twice. He carried a cloth bundle over one shoulder and a short-handled mason's hammer tucked through a rope belt. He did not speak. He stood at the lip of the cut and looked not at Clara, but at her trench. His eyes moved along the channel walls, the stone placement, the clay she had packed into the lower joints. His gaze stopped at the point where the channel would need to turn, the elbow, the place where smoke would have to change direction and continue traveling before it rose. Clara straightened. Creek mud dripped from her hands. She waited for the question that always came from anyone who saw what she was building, the confusion, the mockery, the headshake. She waited for him to laugh or walk away. He did neither. He climbed down into the cut, crouched beside the channel wall, and ran 2 fingers along the seam where stone met clay. He pressed his thumbnail into the joint and checked the depth. Then he looked at the elbow point, the unbuilt section where 2 flat stones sat waiting, and his mouth moved once, the way a man's mouth moves when he is solving a problem he has solved before. He said, in English that was careful and accented but perfectly clear, "Your turn is too wide. The smoke will cool before it reaches the far end." Clara stared at him. Nobody had looked at her trench and understood what it was trying to do. Not Silas, not Nora, not the ranch hands who called it a mud grave. This man had looked at it for 30 seconds and diagnosed the exact flaw she had been worrying about for 2 days. She said, "How tight should the turn be?" He held up his hands, palms facing each other, about 8 inches apart. He said, "No wider than this. The gas must stay fast through the bend. If it slows, it drops its heat too early, and your far end stays cold." Clara said, "Who are you?" His name was Wei Jian. He had worked railroad camps, cookhouses, and masonry crews from California to Montana over 20 years. He had built and repaired flues, ovens, and chimneys in places where Chinese workers were needed for their skill and despised for their presence in the same breath. The exclusion laws and the violence that ran ahead of the laws had narrowed his world year by year. He had drifted into the Powder River country doing odd repair work for ranches that would hire a Chinese hand when the job was too precise for their own men and too cheap to bring a white mason from town. He slept in a lean-to behind a line shack 2 miles down creek, tolerated by the Crescent Bar because he could fix what their hands could not and because he stayed invisible enough to ignore. He had seen Clara's smoke. He had come not from kindness, but from recognition. He had watched her stack stones and pack clay and lay out a channel system, and he had seen in the arrangement something that was not guesswork. It was rough. It was undersized in places and overbuilt in others. But the principle, horizontal heat path, mass absorption, delayed exhaust, was correct. And correct principle in wrong hands was something Wei Jian could not walk past. He said, "You've seen this before. Not here." Clara said, "My father repaired kilns and bake ovens. He showed me how heat travels through clay." Wei nodded once. He set down his cloth bundle, took the mason's hammer from his belt, and knelt beside the elbow point. He said, "Show me where you want the smoke to go." Wei-Jin did not teach the way a schoolmaster teaches. He taught the way a man teaches who learned by doing and expects the same from anyone worth his time. He did not explain and then demonstrate. He made Clara work, and the work was the explanation. The first lesson came that morning in the dirt. He took a stick and told Clara to get on her hands and knees. She did. He told her to crawl the smoke route from the firebox throat to the flue rise, dragging the stick along the ground to mark every turn, every straight, every rise point. She crawled 10 feet through frozen mud with her knees soaking through her skirt and the stick scratching a line that wobbled where the path confused her. Wei crouched at the far end and watched. When she reached him, he pointed at a spot where her line had wavered, a place where she had hesitated between going straight and making a second turn. He said, "If the builder does not know the path, the draft will not know the path. Smoke is not clever. Smoke goes where pressure and heat send it. If you give it two choices, it will choose the wrong one." He made her crawl it again. This time the line was clean. The second lesson came that afternoon, when they began laying the elbow stones. Clara had been fitting stones carefully, choosing the flattest faces, pressing them together, filling gaps with fistfuls of clay. Wei watched her for 10 minutes without speaking. Then he pulled one of her stones out of the wall, held it up, and pointed at the gap between it and the stone beside it. He said, "This is where your bench fails. Not the stones. The joints. Tight joints hold heat. Loose joints leak smoke. Every gap you leave is a place where heat escapes before it reaches the mass." He showed her how to butter clay into the seam gaps, pressing it deep with his thumb, scraping the excess, then pressing again until the joint was sealed flush. He showed her how to cut strips of old sacking and press them into the outer clay layer to reduce cracking as the clay dried. The fibers held the surface together the way straw holds mud plaster on an adobe wall. Clara asked why the outer surface mattered if the heat was inside. Wei said, "A crack on the outside becomes a crack on the inside. Clay shrinks as it dries. If the outside splits, the split travels inward until it reaches the smoke channel. Then you have a leak you cannot see and cannot reach. Seal it before it starts." The third lesson did not come until the following day, and it was the one Clara resisted. Wei told her to build a clean-out opening at the low point of each channel, a removable stone or brick that could be pulled out to clear ash and soot from the smoke path. Clara said she did not have time to add openings. She had 2 channels to build and maybe 10 days before weather. Wei said, "A warm bench that cannot be cleaned is a warm bench for 1 week. After 1 week, the ash chokes the channel and the draft dies. After 2 weeks, you have a cold stone table. Build the clean out or do not build the bench," Clara argued. Wei did not argue back. He simply stopped working and sat on the bank with his hands on his knees, waiting. After 20 minutes of silence, Clara built the clean-out. Later, when the argument had cooled, she asked him why he had come, why he had stopped and climbed into the trench of a stranger. Wei said, "I saw someone who measures before she builds. That is not common." He did not say more. He did not need to. The partnership was not charity. It was recognition. She had the principle. He had the craft. Neither was complete without the other, and both of them knew it. The days shortened. The light turned pale and thin, the kind of light that looks like it has already apologized for leaving. The creek froze deeper every morning. Wind came off the basin steady and sharp, testing the lean-to walls, probing the gaps Clara had stuffed with rags and dried grass. They worked from first light until they could not see their hands. The construction moved in stages, each one harder than the last. Week 1 had been the foundation trench and the first channel walls. Clara had done that alone, and her body had paid for it. Blistered palms cracked open and bled into the clay, a bruise across her right shin where a stone had slipped from a stack, shoulders that seized when she reached above her head. Week 2 was channel completion. Wei showed her how to set the connecting turn between the two main runs, a tight curve built of 3 angled stones with clay packed so thick around them that the joint became a solid elbow of mass. They laid the channel floors with flat stones shimmed level on sand beds. They lined the inner walls with the best stone Clara had gathered and filled the spaces between with broken salvage brick she had bought from a demolished outbuilding in Buffalo for 35 cents, all she could carry in 2 trips on foot. The collapse came on the 9th day. Clara had set a top slab too early before the clay beneath it had firmed enough to bear the weight. The slab shifted. The channel wall below it buckled inward. 3 feet of carefully packed stonework folded like a card house, dumping loose clay and gravel into the channel she had spent 2 days sealing. She stood over the wreckage with her fists at her sides and her jaw trembling, not from cold, from the knowledge that she had just lost 2 days she did not have. Wei climbed down into the trench and looked at the damage. He did not comfort her. He said, "You loaded the top before the base could hold it. Next time, wait a day." Clara said she did not have a day. Wei said, "You do not have a collapsed bench either, which costs more." She rebuilt it. She waited the day. The weather did not wait with her. Week 3 brought the top slabs and the first successful smoke draw. Clara lit a small test fire in the firebox, sage twigs and willow bark, barely a double handful, and watched the smoke enter the channel throat. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. The smoke pooled, thickened, and her stomach dropped. Then the draft caught. The smoke pulled forward, thinned, traveled the length of the first channel, turned the elbow, ran the second channel, and rose through the crude flue pipe Nora had brought, a bent stovepipe length that had belonged to her dead husband, handed over without ceremony or sentiment. The draw worked. The smoke moved. Clara pressed her hand against the clay above the first channel and felt warmth building under her palm. Wei watched the smoke rise from the flue and said nothing, but he stayed another hour checking seams. Week 4 was the outer shell. Clay packed thick over the top slabs, smoothed and tamped to form the sleeping surface. More clay around the sides with sacking strips pressed into the wet surface to hold it together while it dried. The firebox was sheltered by a wall of sawed blocks and a scrap of sheet metal Clara had pried from an abandoned wagon box. The flue rose through a hole in the roof she had patched with hides and sealed with clay around the pipe. The lean-to itself improved alongside the bench. Clara and Wei banked the outer walls with sod cut from the creek meadow. Heavy, back-breaking work. 2 people doing what should have been 4. They hung a doubled hide over the doorway. They stuffed every gap they could reach with dried grass and rags. The shelter would never be tight, but it was less open than before, and less open meant less heat stolen by wind. The setbacks did not stop because the build was moving. A sudden freeze in the 3rd week turned wet clay brittle overnight. Clara lost a section of outer shell that cracked and fell away from the channel wall, exposing the stone beneath. She and Wei patched it with fresh clay mixed thick with chopped straw, but the patch would take days to cure, and days were the currency she was running out of fastest. A ranch hand, young, bored, showing off for the others, stole Clara's stacked willow bundle as a prank while she was at the creek digging clay. She came back to find the brush gone and boot prints leading toward the crescent bar fence. 3 days of gathered fuel, taken as a joke. She did not chase the prints. She walked to the creek and gathered more, working until dark. A windstorm stripped part of her roof patch loose. The hide flapped for half a night before she could get it secured, and by morning the bench surface was dusted with fine, dry snow that had blown through the gap. She and Wei relashed the hide with rope salvaged from a broken halter Nora brought, and Clara sealed the edges with wet clay that froze into a gasket before it could dry properly. She burned her left forearm resetting a hot stone during a test firing. The stone shifted in the channel wall, and she grabbed it barehanded to keep it from falling into the smoke path. The burn blistered in a stripe from wrist to elbow. Wei wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth without comment and handed her back the spoon handle she used for tamping. And then, in the 4th week, with the bench nearly complete and the outer shell drying, a hairline crack appeared at the elbow turn, the exact joint they had rebuilt after the collapse. Smoke leaked through it during a test fire. Not much. A thin thread, barely visible, but visible was enough. Wei pointed at it and said one word. Open. Clara knew what he meant. He wanted her to break open the section, tear through the dried outer shell, remove the top slab, expose the joint, and rebuild it. She had spent 3 days finishing that section. The bench was nearly done. The weather was closing in. Every hour mattered. She looked at the crack. She looked at Wei. She picked up the mason's hammer and broke the section open. It took a full day to expose the joint, repack it, reseat the top slab, and reshell the outer surface. A full day she could not afford, spent on a repair that might have been unnecessary. The crack might have sealed itself under more clay, might have been too small to matter in a real burn. Wei watched her work and said, "A flaw you can see is a flaw you can fix. A flaw you cover is a flaw that waits." That was the night Elias Rourke rode past at dusk and saw Clara on her knees, smashing open her own nearly finished bench with a hammer to fix a crack most people would have ignored. He watched from horseback for a long time. He did not dismount. He did not speak. Something in his expression shifted. Not conversion, not respect, but the first faint disturbance of a certainty that had never been tested. He rode on. Nora Vale came quietly and often. She did not announce her help as help. She brought things and set them down and left. 1 sack of oats carried on her shoulder for 2 miles. 2 old quilts, patched but heavy, that smelled of cedar and someone else's life. The bent stovepipe length that became the flue rise. Her late husband's mason's trowel, a good one, steel blade, walnut handle worn smooth, left on Clara's trunk one morning without a note. Clara tried to thank her. Nora said, "If you die out here with my husband's trowel, I will be cross about the trowel." It was the closest Nora came to saying she wanted Clara to live. Silas Hume came back on a gray afternoon in late November. He rode the same dun horse. He wore the same expression. He dismounted without greeting and walked the shelter the way he had walked it 3 weeks earlier, hands testing walls, boots kicking posts, eyes measuring everything against the verdict he had already delivered. But the shelter was different now. The sod banking rose to the eave line on 3 sides. The doorway was curtained with doubled hide, and against the interior wall, filling most of the living space, sat a long clay bench that had not been there before. 10 feet of packed earth and stone, smooth on top, with a crude firebox throat visible through the wall at one end, and a stovepipe flue rising through the patched roof at the other. Silas ran his hand along the bench surface. He crouched and looked at the firebox opening. He stood and studied the flue connection. He pressed his palm flat against the clay above where the channels ran and held it there for a long moment. He said, "It is warm." Clara said, "The last fire was 4 hours ago." Silas pulled his hand back. He looked at the bench, and then at Clara, and then at the bench again, as though he was seeing something he recognized from a long way off but could not name. He said, "It is warm now. The storm is not here yet." He mounted and rode east. It was not conversion, but it was the smallest possible crack in certainty, and cracks, Clara knew, travel inward. By the end of November, the shelter was finished. Not perfect, Not beautiful, but finished. The lean-to stood banked with sod and brush on three sides. The heated bench ran the length of the interior wall, 10 feet long, 3 feet wide, 2.5 feet high at the sleeping surface, packed with clay 4 to 5 inches thick over stone and salvaged brick channels. The exterior firebox sat under a crude weather hood of sod and sheet metal. The flue rose through the patched roof and stood 3 feet above the ridge, braced with wire Nora had salvaged from a broken fence spool. Way and Clara ran repeated test burns. They learned the bench's rhythms the way you learn a living thing, how much fuel produced, how much heat, how long the warmth held after flame, where the surface was hottest, where it cooled first. One short, hot burn, a tight bundle of willow and sage, fed fast and allowed to flare, warmed the bench face noticeably within half an hour. The sleeping surface remained warm to the touch well after the visible flame died, and the firebox went to ash. The air near the bench stayed bearable, even when frost whitened the doorway cracks, and the fuel consumed in a single burn was a fraction of what an iron stove demanded to hold the same hours of heat. Clara lay on the bench after a late afternoon firing and pressed her back against the clay. Warmth rose through her shoulder blades, her spine, the backs of her legs. Not the sharp, temporary warmth of sitting beside a fire. A different kind, deep, slow, the kind that said it would still be there when she woke. She closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, her body stopped shaking, but the storm was not here yet. Nora came with worry on her face. She said, "What happens when the wind pushes down the flue? I have seen downdraft kill a stove fire in a gust. What does it do to this?" Clara did not have an answer. She had not tested the system in real wind. Silas's words returned at night and sat beside her on the bench like an uninvited guest. Warm now. Storm not here yet. Elias doubled down. He told his hands at supper that the girl on the creek had built herself a clay coffin and would be in it soon enough. He raised the wager, a month's wages against anyone who believed a mud bench would outlast a Wyoming norther. Nobody took the bet. But nobody told Elias he was wrong either, because nobody was certain he was. The horses came in from the range with ice in their manes. The creek sealed thicker each morning. Ranch women hung extra blankets over windows and stacked firewood closer to their doors. The barometer talk started among older hands, men who had been on the range long enough to read the sky the way a sailor reads the sea. The sky turned the color of a thing that has stopped pretending, not gray, not white. A pale, hard blankness, as though distance itself had been erased and replaced with weather that had not yet decided to fall, but had already decided to come. Way did not congratulate Clara on the finished bench. He stood beside it on the last evening of November, looked at the sky through the open doorway, and said 3 words. Now winter decides. The norther came in the first week of December, in the teeth of the season that would break the open-range cattle industry across Wyoming and Montana and leave dead stock piled against fence lines from the Powder River to the Yellowstone. It came the way the worst storms come on the northern plains, not gradually, not with the slow dignity of a season turning, but as an assault. The temperature had been dropping for 2 days. Then, on a Tuesday evening, the wind shifted north and the drop stopped being gradual. The air turned sharp and metallic. Snow began not as flakes, but as a fine driving grit that stung exposed skin and reduced visibility to the length of a horse. Within 2 hours, the grit became a wall. The wind screamed along the creek bottom and hit the lean-to like a shoulder slamming a door. Clara had fired the bench hot in the late afternoon before the worst of the wind. She had fed the firebox 3 loads in the quick succession, willow bundles, cottonwood bark, dried sage roots, pushing heat into the channels until the clay surface was warm enough to hold a hand against comfortably. Then she let the fire drop and sealed the firebox damper to slow the exhaust. The first complication arrived within the hour. Wei was not there. He had left at dusk to help two men at a line shack 2 miles down creek, a Chinese cook named Sung and a stable hand who had been coughing for a week. Wei had said he would return before full dark. Full dark came. Wei did not. Clara stood at the high doorway and looked into a world that had been erased. The wind drove snow sideways. The fence posts had vanished. The cottonwoods were sounds, not shapes, creaking and snapping somewhere in the white. She called Wei's name twice and heard nothing come back except the wind folding her voice flat and throwing it away. She dropped the hide and sealed the door edge with wet clay and rags, pressing the mixture into the gap between hide and frame until her fingers went numb. The clay began to freeze as she worked, hardening into a crude gasket that held the wind out better than any hinge. Inside, the bench was warm. The air above it was tolerable. The air at floor level was cold and getting colder. The lean-to walls creaked under the gusts. Snow found the gap she had missed, a thin line of white dust along the base of the north wall, a feathering of ice crystals around the flue pipe where the seal was not perfect. The second complication came at the worst hour. Near midnight, a gust hit the lean-to hard enough to lift the edge of the roof patch above the flue. The hide flapped once, twice, and on the third flap the wind found the opening and drove downward through the gap. The flue draft reversed. Smoke that had been rising obediently began to push backward, seeping from the firebox throat into the shelter's air. Clara smelled it before she saw it. The bitter, stinging smell of incomplete combustion, not the clean smell of wood smoke, but the heavy, choking smell of gases that should have left and had not. She grabbed a blanket, wrapped it over her head and shoulders, and went outside. The wind hit her like a wall of broken glass. Snow drove into her eyes, her nose, her mouth. She could not see the flue pipe. She could not see the roof edge. She stumbled along the lean-to wall with one hand on the sod banking and the other holding the blanket against the wind. The cold was not temperature. It was force, a physical pressure against every surface of her body, stealing heat faster than her blood could replace it. She found the firebox. The crude windbreak of sod and sheet metal had shifted. One sod block had toppled, exposing the firebox face to the full force of the north wind. The wind was driving into the firebox throat and up through the channels, reversing the draft, pushing smoke back through every joint and seam. Clara pulled the sod block back into place with hands she could barely close. She stacked a second block beside it. She pressed her body against the windbreak to hold it while she packed snow and frozen clay into the gaps between the blocks. The wind fought her. The snow blinded her. Her fingers stopped reporting sensation. She worked by feel and by the memory of where the blocks needed to be. When the windbreak held, she crawled back inside and dropped the hide behind her. She lay on the bench floor gasping, her lungs burning, her face raw, her hands white and senseless. The smoke smell was fading. The draft was recovering. The bench beneath her was still warm. She lay there for a long time, breathing, letting the warmth climb back into her from below. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She was alive. But alive and safe were not the same word, and the storm had hours left to run. She realized the bench was warm, but the shelter air was not. The volume of the lean-to was too large. Warm air rose from the bench surface and dispersed into the full height of the shelter, thinning until it meant nothing. She needed less air. She needed a smaller space. Clara pulled the quilts Nora had given her and hung them from the roof poles, creating a low canopy over the bench, a tent within the shelter, capturing the rising warmth in a space small enough to hold it. She lowered her bedding from the bench top to the bench surface itself, lying directly on the warm clay with the quilts draped close above her. The difference was immediate. The trapped air warmed. Her body stopped shaking. The warmth came from below, through the clay, through the stone, through the channels where the last heat of the fire still traveled, and the quilts held it above her like a held breath. She rationed the fuel by firing in pulses, not panic feeding the box the way the bunkhouse men fed their stoves, stuff in wood until the iron glowed, and then stuff in more when the glow faded. Short, hot burns. A tight bundle pushed into the firebox, allowed to flare fast, then left to die while the mass absorbed. Wait. Let the bench hold. Fire again only when the surface cooled enough to feel it through her blanket. During the deepest hours, 2, 3 in the morning, the black center of the night when the wind sounded like it was trying to disassemble the world board by board, the visible fire disappeared entirely. The firebox was ash, no glow, no flame, nothing but the memory of combustion stored in 10 feet of clay and stone. Clara lay on the bench with her palm flat against the surface. Warm, not blazing, not the searing heat of a stoveplate, but warm the way her father's brick wall had been warm when she was 9, deep, patient, slow to arrive, and slow to leave. The warmth pressed upward through her shoulder blades and the small of her back and the backs of her legs, and the quilts held it close, and the wind screamed outside like something that had been promised a body and was furious to find the promise broken. Across the range that night, the storm took what it could. At the Crescent Bar bunkhouse, men fed the iron stove every hour, dragging wood from the pile outside through a door they could barely open against the drift. The stove roared and cooled and roared again. The heat climbed through the shingled roof and vanished. One man burned his hand on the stove door in the dark. Another woke at 3 to find the fire dead and the water bucket frozen to the floor. At a claim, shanty 4 miles east, a man named Parcell ran short of fuel at midnight. He had stacked what he thought was enough. It was not enough. He broke a chair. He broke the table. He tore boards from the interior wall and fed them to the stove. By dawn, his shanty was half dismantled, and the stove was cooling again, and Parcell was crouched in a corner with a blanket over his head, shaking so hard his teeth chipped. At line camps up and down the basin, cowboys fought drifting cattle and freezing wind and stove fires that demanded feeding every hour. The open-range system had been built for summers and roundups, not for the kind of winter that kills standing cattle and buries fence posts and turns the arithmetic of an entire industry into a lie. That winter, the winter of 1886 into 1887, would be remembered as the season that ended the cattle boom, that littered the coulees with frozen carcasses, that taught the Northern Plains something the Northern Plains had always known and the cattle kings had refused to learn. Clara did not know any of this. She knew only that the wind was still screaming and the bench was still warm, and her body, for the first time since the storm had begun, was not shaking. She slept, not deeply, not safely, but she slept, and the clay held her, and the heat her father had taught her to trap stayed where she had told it to stay. Elias Rourke rode out at dawn. He told himself he was checking fence. He told himself the storm demanded a ride along the creek line to assess damage and drift. He told himself these things because the alternative, that he was riding to see whether the girl on the creek was dead, required an honesty he was not yet prepared for. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind still pushed drifts across the flat in long, curving waves. The temperature had not risen. The air was the kind of cold that hurts the lungs and makes the eyes water and freeze in the same breath. His horse moved reluctantly, head low, nostrils rimmed with ice. He saw the lean-to from 200 yards. It was still standing. barely. Snow had drifted against the north wall to the eave line. The sod banking was crusted white. The high doorway was sealed. No smoke rose from the flue. No smoke, no fire, no sign of life. If you have been holding your breath waiting for what Elias finds behind that doorway, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens in the next 60 seconds changes everything he thought he knew. Elias dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post nearest the lean-to. He walked to the doorway. He pulled the frozen edge of the hide aside. The air inside hit him in the face. It was warm, not stifling, not the blast furnace heat of a roaring stove, but warm, the kind of warm that has no visible source, the kind that seems to come from the walls and the floor and the space itself, as if the shelter had decided on its own to reject the cold outside. There was no fire. The firebox throat was dark. The stovepipe flue was cold to the touch. There was no flame, no glow, no ember. There was only a long clay bench filling most of the interior space, and on that bench, under two quilts draped low from the roof poles, a woman asleep, alive, warm, on a night that had killed cattle standing and driven men to burn their own furniture. Elias stood in the doorway with his hand still holding the hide and the cold at his back and the warmth on his face. He looked at the bench. He stepped inside and knelt. He placed his palm flat on the clay surface, the way a man touches something he does not believe in to prove it is real. The clay was warm, not from the air, from inside, from the mass itself. Heat stored in stone and clay and channels he could not see, held there by physics he did not understand, radiating upward through the surface hours after the last flame had died. He put his other hand on the wall behind him. The wall was freezing. The bench was warm. The difference between the two, between dead cold and living heat, between the wall that had given up and the bench that had held on, was the distance between everything Elias Rourke believed and everything Clara Mercer had built. Clara opened her eyes. She saw Elias kneeling beside her bench with both hands flat on the clay and an expression on his face she had never seen on any man before. Not mockery, not pity, not the confident dismissal she had learned to expect from him. Something else. Something that looked like the moment before a man admits he was wrong, when the admission is still gathering in his chest and has not yet reached his mouth. He did not speak at first. Then he said, barely above a whisper, "What in God's name did you build?" Clara sat up. The quilts fell to her waist. Her hair was matted. Her face was raw from the wind she had fought at midnight. The burn on her forearm was visible above the blanket edge. She said, "A bed that remembers the fire after the fire goes out." Elias pulled his hand from the bench. He stood. He looked at the flue, the firebox throat through the wall, the clay packed thick over channels he was only beginning to understand. Outside, his horse stood with ice on its mane and the wind cutting across the flat. Behind him, in a shelter built of scrap and mud and creek stone by a girl the town had thrown away, the air was warm and the fire was dead and the warmth remained. He walked out into the cold. He mounted. He sat the horse for a long time facing east toward the crescent bar, not moving. Then he turned the horse and rode, and the cold followed him, and the warmth stayed where Clara had told it to stay. Word of what Elias Rourke found behind that doorway traveled faster than he did. He did not tell the story himself. He did not need to. One of the hands who had ridden with him to check fence that morning saw his face when he returned to the crescent bar, saw the way he dismounted without speaking, and walked to the bunkhouse stove and stood beside it with his hand open over the iron, looking at the heat as though he had never seen heat before and was trying to understand where it went. The hand asked what he had found at the creek. Elias said, She is alive. He did not say more, but the hand who asked told the cook, and the cook told the supply rider, and the supply rider told the clerk in Buffalo, and by the end of the week the story had traveled the circuit that all stories travel in cattle country, from bunkhouse to kitchen to store counter to church step. And the shape of the story was this. The girl on Crazy Woman Creek had survived the norther without a stove, without visible fire, without burning her walls or her furniture or anything except a few bundles of willow and sage. She had slept through the worst night of the season on a clay bench that was warm when everything else was frozen, and Elias Rourke had put his hand on it and felt the warmth himself. People did not believe it at first. Then they began to ride out and see. Silas Hume came first, because Silas Hume had given the verdict, and the verdict had been wrong. He arrived on the second day after the storm, when the drifts were still waist-high along the creek bottom, and the temperature had not climbed above 0. He dismounted without greeting. He walked the shelter the way he always walked it, hands testing, boots kicking, eyes measuring. But this time the measurements told a different story. The bench was intact. The channels had not cracked. The flue had drawn through the worst wind Clara had ever heard. The clay surface was cool now. The last firing had been 18 hours ago. But when Clara lit a small fire in the firebox and let it burn for 20 minutes and then let it die, the warmth began building in the bench within the hour. Silas pressed his palm to the surface and held it there. He stood for a long time without speaking. Clara did not feel the silence. She had learned that the silences of men like Silas were not empty. They were the sound of pride rearranging itself into a shape that could hold an admission. Silas said, "I told you that you would die because cold gets in faster than you can feed it." Clara said, "You did." Silas said, "I was wrong about the wood." He paused. The words came slowly, as though each one cost him something he had been carrying for a long time. "You did not need more fire. You needed less waste." Clara nodded. She did not gloat. She did not repeat his own words back to him. She let the admission stand on its own legs because a man like Silas Hume does not make admissions twice, and the first one deserves respect. Silas asked how the channels were laid, not from curiosity, from the need to understand what he had missed. Clara showed him. She walked him through the firebox throat, the channel path, the elbow turn, the flue rise. She showed him the clean-out Way had insisted on. She showed him the clay thickness over the channels and the sacking fibers pressed into the outer shell. Silas listened the way he had once listened to old cattlemen explain why certain valleys held grass longer than others, with the focused attention of a man who has been proven wrong and intends to learn why. When he left, he said, "I will send a widow named Doll to talk to you. She has a cabin on the North Fork with a stove that eats wood like it has a grudge. She will want to know what you know." It was the first time anyone in authority had sent someone to Clara instead of warning them away. Nora Vale's conversion was not a single moment. It was the slow accumulation of evidence that a woman who asks hard questions cannot ignore. She had watched the bench go up. She had asked every question the audience would ask: draft, cracking, heat distribution, fuel demand. She had delivered the stovepipe and the quilts and the trowel. She had said plainly that she believed Clara would die. Now she stood in the lean-to 2 days after the storm with her hand on the bench, and her questions changed. Nora said, "How much wood did you burn through the night?" Clara showed her the remaining fuel stack. She had started the storm with approximately 2 wheelbarrow loads of willow bundles and sage roots. She had used perhaps a third of it through the worst night of the season. The bunkhouse at the Crescent Bar, she had heard, burned through 2 full cords in the same period, feeding the stove every hour. Nora stared at the fuel pile. She said, "That is not possible." Clara said, "The bench holds what the stove throws away. The stove heats the air. The air leaves through every crack. The bench heats the clay. The clay does not leave. Nora sat on the bench. She sat there for a long time. The warmth came up through her skirt and her petticoat and reached her skin, and her face changed the way faces change when the body receives something the mind has been arguing against. She said, "Show me how to build one." Clara said, "I will." From that day forward, Nora was not a doubter who visited. She was a student who stayed. Through December, they came. Not in crowds. This was still the northern range, and people were scattered across miles of snow and grass and frozen creek, but in ones and twos, riding or walking to the lean-to on Crazy Woman Creek to see what the thrown-out girl had built. A widow named Doll, sent by Silas, arrived with her 16-year-old son and a list of questions written on the back of a feed receipt. She wanted to know clay ratios. She wanted to know channel height. She wanted to know whether the firebox could be built inside the cabin wall rather than outside, because her north wall faced the worst wind, and she did not want to go outside to feed a fire. Clara drew diagrams in the dirt and answered every question with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge hoarded is knowledge wasted. 2 line camp men from an outfit south of the creek rode in and asked whether the bench could be scaled for a bunkhouse. They were tired of feeding a stove all night. They were tired of waking at 3 a.m. to shove wood into a box that forgot the heat the moment they turned their backs. Clara told them the channels could be widened and the bench lengthened, but the draft had to be proportional. A longer bench needed a taller flue to maintain pull. A rancher's wife named Tolliver walked 4 miles in snow to look at the bench and touch it and ask whether it could be used in a lambing shed. She had lost newborn stock to cold in 3 consecutive springs. Clara said she thought a low warming wall with a heated ledge could work, though she had not built one yet. Each visitor carried something away, a measurement, a principle, a conviction that what they had touched was real. And each visitor left behind something too, the slow, accumulating proof that Clara was no longer a girl the town had discarded. She was becoming something else, something that had no clean name in cattle country, because cattle country had never needed a word for a woman who built heat out of mud and memory. Elias Rourke's first response to the validation was not conversion. It was commerce. He rode to the lean-to 10 days after the storm, dismounted, and stood in front of Clara with his hat in his hands. His face had the careful, controlled expression of a man who is about to make an offer he expects to be accepted because he has always had money and money has always been accepted. He said, "I will pay you $40 for the design. You teach my men how to build it in the line shacks. I have exclusive use on Crescent Bar property. You do not teach anyone else." Clara looked at him. $40 was more money than she had held at one time in her life. It was enough for supplies, for better materials, for tools she needed. It was security, the thing she had not had since the night she walked out of Buffalo with a trunk and a broken brick. She said, "No." Elias blinked. He said, "50." Clara said, "It is not about the price. I will not sell exclusive use. The method works. People need it. I will teach anyone who comes." Elias said, "Then I will pay you to teach my men first." Clara said, "You can pay me fairly for the labor, but I will teach whoever asks, in whatever order they come." Elias put his hat back on. His jaw tightened. He was not angry in the way men get angry when they are refused a purchase. He was angry the way men get angry when the rules they understand, money buys, money controls, money decides, fail to operate. He had offered to buy the thing that had embarrassed him, and the woman who had embarrassed him had refused to let it be bought. He said, "You are making a mistake." Clara said, "I have made several. This is not one of them." He rode east. He did not look back. But the offer had changed something between them, because a man who tries to buy what he cannot dismiss has already admitted, in the language of money, that the thing has value. Wei Jian returned 3 days after the storm, limping. He had made it to the line shack and helped Sung and the stable hand survive the night by banking the shack walls with snow and keeping a small fire alive in a cracked stove they braced with stones. On the walk back, in the gray half-light of the storm's aftermath, he had stepped into a drift-hidden wash and turned his ankle hard enough that the joint swelled to twice its size and turned the color of a rotten plum. He made it to Clara's lean-to using a cottonwood branch as a crutch, his face set in the expression of a man who considers acknowledging pain to be a form of waste. Clara sat him on the bench. She wrapped his ankle with strips of cloth soaked in cold creek water. She fed him oat porridge and coffee, and then, because Wei would not rest until he had checked, she showed him the bench. He ran his hands along every seam. He crouched, painfully, leaning on the bench edge, and looked into the firebox throat. He checked the clean-out. He pressed the outer shell at the elbow turn where the crack had been, and found it solid. He sat back on the bench and looked at Clara. He did not smile. Wei Jian was not a man who smiled when something was well built. He was a man who simply stopped looking for flaws, and the absence of his searching was the highest praise he gave. He said, "The joints held," Clara said, "because you made me rebuild them." Wei said, "Because you rebuilt them correctly." They sat together on the warm bench while the wind pushed snow against the walls outside. For a moment, the lean-to was not a shelter built from scraps by a thrown-out girl and a drifting Chinese mason. It was something older and simpler, a warm place where two people who had each been discarded by the world they worked in sat side by side and did not need to explain to each other what that meant. The weeks that followed were the closest thing to good that Clara had known since her father died. She and Wei worked together, not teacher and student now, but partners. They corrected the chimney height on the widow doll's cabin, adding 2 feet of flue because the original draw was sluggish in crosswinds. They chose flatter stones for a bench Wei helped Clara design for Nora's shack, a shorter version, 7 feet, single channel, simpler to build and maintain. They spent a full day explaining clean-out procedure to a line camp hand who kept packing the ash trap with clay instead of leaving it accessible. Wei stood behind the man with his arms folded and his face unreadable until the hand got it right on the 4th attempt. Clara began translating Wei's craft into frontier materials and frontier language. Wei thought in terms of brick and fired clay and precise mortar joints. The people who came to Clara had creek mud, rough stone, and no patience for precision they could not see. Clara learned to bridge the gap, to take Wei's standards and express them in measurements a rancher's wife could replicate with a stick and a flat stone in common sense. They clashed once, hard, over a chimney design for a larger bench Clara wanted to build. Clara said the flue could be shorter if the channels were steeper. A sharper angle would create more pull without the height. Wei said shorter flues invited downdraft. He had seen 3 chimneys fail because builders cut height to save materials. The draft was not just pull, it was protection against wind reversal. Height was insurance. Height was the difference between a bench that worked in calm air and a bench that worked when the weather tried to kill you. Clara said she had survived the norther with a flue 3 feet above the ridge. Wei said, "You survived because you went outside in a blizzard and fixed the windbreak with your bare hands. A taller flue, and you would not have needed to." Clara went quiet. He was right. The midnight scramble to restack the sod blocks, the wind in her face, the snow blinding her, the cold stealing the feeling from her fingers, had been the closest she came to dying that night. A taller flue pulling harder, resisting the downdraft, might have held the draw without her risking her life to fix it from outside. She built the flue taller. Wei's limp did not improve. Through December and into January, the ankle remained swollen. He wrapped it. He walked on it. He worked on it. But the joint ground when he moved, and some mornings Clara saw him sitting on the bench edge with his boot off and his face turned away, and she knew the pain was worse than he would say. There was more than the ankle. Wei's position in the Powder River country had always been temporary, held in place by usefulness and threatened by everything else. The exclusion laws were federal. The violence was local. Chinese workers across the West lived in a narrowing corridor between the skills that made them needed and the hatred that made them hunted. Wei had survived by staying small, staying quiet, staying useful to people who would not defend him if the mood turned. The mood could always turn. He told Clara one evening, while they sat on the bench watching firelight from the flue mouth flicker against the sod wall, that he had word of a larger camp south, a railroad maintenance crew that needed a mason, and where Chinese workers were numerous enough to offer some safety in numbers. He could not stay in a place where he was one man, tolerated but unprotected, aging, limping, visible. Clara said, "Stay through winter. The ankle needs rest." Wei said, "The ankle is not what decides." She understood. She did not argue. She had been thrown out of a town for slapping a man who deserved it. Wei had spent 20 years being thrown out of an entire country's welcome for the crime of being skilled in Chinese and present. She could not offer him safety. She could only offer him a warm bench in her company, and both of those things, against the arithmetic of exclusion, were not enough. Wei left on a morning in late January, when the sky was the color of old tin, and the wind had paused long enough for a man with a bad ankle and a cloth bundle to walk south without freezing. Clara walked with him to the creek crossing. They stood there in the cold. She did not know what to say because the things she wanted to say, "Stay, teach me more, do not leave me to do this alone," were things she had no right to ask of a man whose survival depended on going. Wei said, "You do not need me for the next one. You need the principal. You have the principal." He adjusted the bundle on his shoulder. He looked at her once, a long, level look that carried everything he was not going to say aloud, and then he turned and walked south along the frozen creek bank, his limp marking time against the snow. Clara stood at the crossing until he was small against the white. Then she walked back to the lean-to, sat on the bench, and pressed her palm flat against the warm clay. The warmth was still there. The man who had taught her to hold it was gone. And the winter, indifferent to both facts, continued. The secondary crisis came 6 weeks later, in the first week of March, when winter should have been loosening its grip, but instead tightened it like a fist, reminding the plains who still held authority. A late cold snap drove the temperature back below zero on a night when the Crescent Bar's lambing shed, a long, low structure on the east side of the ranch, held 37 newborn lambs, 2 hired boys aged 12 and 14, and a cast-iron stove that cracked down its side seam at 11 o'clock at night. The crack was not subtle. It split the stove from the firebox door to the flue collar, opening a gap wide enough to push a finger through. Smoke poured into the shed. The fire died as draft escaped through the crack. Within an hour, the temperature inside the shed dropped to the temperature outside the shed, which was 14 degrees below zero, and 37 lambs and 2 boys faced the same arithmetic that Clara had faced in November. Nora Vale heard about it before Clara did. She rode to the lean-to at dawn and told Clara what had happened. The boys were wrapped in horse blankets in the far corner of the shed. The lambs were huddled together and dying at the edges of the huddle. Elias Rourke's hands were trying to build an open fire inside the shed, which was filling with smoke and solving nothing. Clara did not hesitate. She did not wait for an invitation from Elias. She packed her father's folding rule, the mason's trowel Nora had given her, and a sack of prepared clay she had mixed and stored under canvas. She walked to the Crescent Bar lambing shed and arrived to find chaos. The shed was long, low-roofed, and hazy with smoke from the open fire the hands had built on the dirt floor. Lambs bleated in thin, high voices. The two boys, one named Orin, one named Fisk, sat against the far wall with their faces pale and their hands tucked under their arms. The cracked stove sat useless in the center of the shed, cold, split, a monument to the failure of iron when iron fails. Elias was there. He saw Clara come through the shed door with Clay on her shoulder and the trowel in her belt. Something crossed his face, not welcome, not refusal, but the particular expression of a man watching the person he mocked walk into the room where his people are freezing. Clara did not ask permission. She did not wait for his authority. She dropped her sack, walked the shed, and began calculating. She could not build a full bench. There was no time. The lambs would die before a 10-foot platform could be laid and fired. But she could build what Way had taught her to build first, a path, a heat path. She found the shed's back wall, which was sod and stone, thick, massive, the best thermal surface available. She built a low channel against its base, using flat stones from the yard and the clay she had carried, sealing the joints with her thumbs the way Way had shown her, fast and firm, not pretty, but tight. She extended the channel 8 feet along the wall. She built a crude firebox at one end using the cracked stove's door as a damper plate and stacked stones as walls. At the far end, she ran the channel into a short, vertical rise, and out through a gap she knocked in the shed's upper wall. It took 3 hours. Her hands bled. The clay was cold and stiff and fodder. The boys watched from across the shed. The hands watched from the doorway. Elias watched from 2 feet away, close enough to see every joint, every seam, every decision. Clara lit the fire at mid-afternoon, dry wood, pushed hard into the crude firebox, burning fast and hot. Smoke entered the channel throat and traveled. For a terrible moment it pooled at the first joint, a seam that was not tight enough, and Clara grabbed a fistful of clay and pressed it into the gap with the heel of her hand. The smoke moved on. It traveled the channel. It rose through the exit and climbed into the cold air outside. Within an hour, the stone and sod wall above the channel was warm to the touch. The boys moved closer. The lambs, following the warmth, the way all young things follow warmth, pressed against the wall in the low stone channel and stopped bleeding. By evening, the shed was not warm in the way a heated house is warm, but the wall was warm, and the air near the wall was warm, and the lambs were alive, and the boys were no longer shaking. If this story has shown you why understanding heat matters more than owning a bigger stove, share it with someone who builds, who plans, who prepares. Because what Clara learned from her father and from Wei Jian is spreading now, and the people it reaches next are the ones who survive. Clara stayed through the night, firing the channel in pulses, checking the joints, watching the lambs. She did not sleep. She did not eat until Orin, the older boy, brought her a cup of coffee and a piece of bread and set them beside her without a word, the way Nora had once set a trowel on her trunk. Sometime after midnight, Elias came into the shed and stood beside the warm wall. He did not speak for a long time. The fire in the crude channel was out. The wall was still warm. The lambs slept against it in a pile of wool and small breath. Elias said, "You did not have to come." Clara said, "The lambs did not have to freeze." Elias said nothing for another long while. Then he said, "I wagered you would die." Clara said, "I remember." Elias looked at the wall, at the sleeping lambs, at the boys curled in horse blankets near the warmth. He looked at Clara, her bleeding hands, the burn scar on her forearm, the exhaustion that sat on her face like something she had been carrying so long it had become part of the structure. He said, "I was wrong about more than the wager." He left the shed. Clara pressed her back against the warm wall and closed her eyes. The heat came through the stone and the sod and the clay, the way it always came, slow, patient, the warmth of mass that has been asked to hold something and holds it. And she thought of Wei Jian, walking south on a frozen creek bank with a limp and a bundle and the principle he had given her. And she thought of her father, pressing her palm against a bread oven in a river town that did not exist anymore. And she thought that the line between those two men and this wall and these sleeping lambs was the straightest line she had ever drawn. By the end of March, Clara was no longer the girl on the creek. She was the woman people sent for before the cold came. Nora had become her first true student. She had learned the clay mixing ratios, the channel dimensions, the logic of draft and flue height. She could build a single-channel bench from foundation to firing in 4 days. She could diagnose a smoke leak by feel, hand moving slowly along the outer shell, waiting for the telltale thread of warmth where warmth should not be. Together, Clara and Nora began taking requests. The Widow Doll's cabin bench was finished and working. 2 line camp shacks had shorter versions, 6-foot benches, single channel, enough to keep one man warm through a night without feeding a stove. The rancher's wife, Tolliver, was next on the list, waiting for the ground to thaw enough to dig a proper foundation. People came to Clara now instead of the other way around. They rode to the lean-to on Crazy Woman Creek with questions and measurements, and sometimes with gifts: a sack of flour, a side of salt pork, a length of rope. Nobody called it payment. Nobody called it charity. It was the unnamed currency of the frontier, skill exchanged for sustenance, knowledge traded for respect. But Elias Rourke's arc was not finished. His admission in the lambing shed, quiet, genuine, earned through the sight of his lambs saved by a woman he had mocked, was not conversion. It was the first crack in a wall built of pride and position, and the particular blindness of a man who has never had to reconsider anything he believed. The crack was real. But cracks, as Clara knew better than anyone, travel slowly through mass, and mass once set does not reshape itself in a single night. What happened next between Clara and Elias Rourke would take longer than a storm. It would take longer than a season. It would take the slow, patient work of 2 people who had started on opposite sides of a wager and were only beginning to understand what it would cost them to meet in the middle. But that is a story the next season would tell. Spring came to the Powder River Basin the way spring comes to country that has been punished, slowly, grudgingly, as though the land needed to be convinced that warmth was not a trick. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, revealing grass so brown it looked burned. The creek broke its ice in sections, grinding downstream in chunks that sounded like crockery falling off a shelf. The wind shifted from north to west and lost the blade edge that had made breathing feel like swallowing broken glass. And across the basin, in coulees and creek bottoms, and along the fence lines that had once marked the boundaries of cattle empires, the dead stock appeared. Thousands of head. Frozen where they had drifted against wire, piled in draws where the snow had buried them standing, scattered across flats where the cold had caught them walking and simply stopped them. The winter of 1886 into 1887 had done what no market crash or drought or rustler war had accomplished. It had broken the open-range model. The men who had believed they could run cattle on free grass and free weather without preparation, without shelter, without reckoning, found their beliefs rotting in the spring thaw alongside their herds. Elias Rourke lost more than a third of his stock. He rode the spring range for a week counting carcasses, and came back each evening with a number higher than the day before. The Crescent Bar was not destroyed. Other outfits were, smaller operations folded entirely, their owners leaving for the railroad towns with nothing but what they could carry, and the knowledge that the land they had trusted had never promised what they assumed. But the Crescent Bar was diminished. The swagger that had carried Elias through November was gone, dissolved by the simple mathematics of dead cattle and surviving debt. The world that had mocked Clara for building a mud bench was the same world that had believed it could outspend winter. Both beliefs had been tested in the same season, under the same sky, by the same cold. Only one had held. Clara's operation, if a woman with a trowel, a student, and a lean-to on borrowed ground could be called an operation, grew through that spring and summer, not because she sought growth, but because need found her. A typical day in May looked nothing like the desperate survival of November. Clara woke on the bench, which she still fired every evening out of habit and loyalty to the warmth that had saved her. She ate oat porridge and coffee. She reviewed the list of requests scratched on a board Nora had nailed to the lean-to wall, 4 names, each with a location and a note about what was needed. A bench for a widow's cabin on the North Fork, a warming wall for a lambing shed 12 miles south, a repair on a cracked flue at a line shack near the Bozeman Road. A consultation. That was the word people were starting to use. Though Clara never did, for a rancher who wanted to know whether the method could be adapted for a root cellar to prevent freeze damage to stored vegetables. She walked to the creek bank where the clay seams still held, now widened by months of digging into a proper excavation with sloped sides and a canvas cover to keep rain off the working stock. She mixed clay the way Way had taught her. Creek clay tempered with sand and chopped straw, worked wet until it held shape without cracking, tested by rolling a rope of it around her finger and checking for splits. If it split, more straw. If it sagged, more sand. The ratio lived in her hands now, not in her memory. Her hands knew before her mind confirmed, the way a baker's hands know dough. Nora arrived by mid-morning, most days, walking the 2 miles from her shack with a canvas sack of tools over her shoulder and the particular expression of a woman who has found work that means something and does not intend to waste daylight. She had her own trowel now, bought new from the store in Buffalo with money earned from mending harness, the first tool she had ever purchased for a trade that did not involve needles. She kept it cleaner than Clara kept hers, and she said so often enough that it had become the kind of argument that holds a friendship together. Together they loaded a handcart with clay, tools, and flat stones, and walked to wherever the work waited. The teaching happened through doing. Clara showed the widowed doll's son how to set channel stones level by laying a straight stick across them and checking for wobble. Any stone that rocked needed shimming with a clay pad before the next course went on. She showed a line camp hand how to butter a joint by pressing clay in with the thumb, not the palm. The thumb found the gaps the palm smeared over, and a gap the palm hid today was a smoke leak the winter found tomorrow. She showed the rancher's wife, Tolliver, how to test draft by holding a lit match at the firebox throat and watching whether the flame pulled inward toward the channel. If the flame leaned in, the draft was alive. If it stood straight or flickered outward, something was blocking the path, and the build had to be opened and checked before another stone went on top. She made her students rebuild their mistakes. She did not do it for them. She stood beside them while they tore open a seam they had sealed too loosely or reset a stone they had laid crooked, and she waited with her arms folded and her face patient in a way that reminded everyone who saw it of a man with a mason's hammer and a rope belt who had once done the same thing to her. One afternoon in June, Clara placed a child's hand, the doll boy's younger sister, 6 years old, round-faced and shy, against the warm surface of the newly fired bench in the widow's cabin. The girl's eyes widened. She pressed both palms flat and looked up at Clara with the particular astonishment of a child who has discovered that the world contains things she did not know were possible. Clara said, "That is what the fire left behind. The bench holds it after the flame goes." The girl said, "It is warm like a horse." Clara almost laughed. She said, "Yes, like a horse." It was the same lesson, the same palm pressed against the same principle. Her father to her, kneeling beside a bread oven on the Missouri. Her to this girl, kneeling beside a clay bench in Wyoming. The line between those two moments was not a memory. It was a road, and people were walking on it. Elias Rourke's full conversion did not arrive in a single scene. It arrived the way spring arrived, in retreating increments, each one revealing something that had been covered by what came before. The first increment was practical. After the lambing shed, Elias sent 2 hands to Clara and asked her to teach them bench construction for 3-line shacks on the Crescent Bar's North Range. He paid her fairly, $3 per shack, plus materials hauled by his wagon. Clara accepted the work, but insisted on teaching the hands to build, not building for them. She would supervise. They would learn. The knowledge would stay with the people who did the labor, not disappear when the builder left. Elias did not argue. This was new. The Elias of November would have insisted on owning the skill the way he owned cattle and fence posts. The Elias of spring listened to the terms and accepted them, and the distance between the 2 men, the one who wagered on her death and the one who accepted her conditions, was the distance the winter had taught him. The second increment was material. In early summer, Elias rode to the lean-to with a wagon load of flat stone, good stone, quarried from a bluff on the Crescent Bar's upper range, better than anything Clara had pulled from the creek wash. He did not announce the delivery. He drove the wagon to the cut, unloaded the stone in a neat stack near her clay pit, and sat on the wagon seat waiting for her to come back from the doll cabin. When she returned and saw the stone, she walked to the wagon and looked up at him. Clara said, "I did not ask for this," Elias said. "I know." Clara said, "What do you want for it?" Elias said, "I want you to use it. It is better stone than what you've been hauling from the creek on your back, and your back has done enough." Clara looked at the stack. It was good stone, flat-faced, consistent thickness, heavy enough to hold heat, and shaped well enough to lay without excessive shimming. It was the kind of stone Way would have approved of. She ran her hand along the top piece and felt the grain under her fingertips. She said, "Thank you." Elias nodded once. He drove the wagon east without further conversation. He had brought stone instead of flowers, and the stone said everything he was not yet able to say with words. The third increment was public, and it cost him more than money or materials. A cattlemen's meeting in Buffalo in July, the kind of gathering where ranch owners, foremen, and territorial men met to discuss the devastation of the winter and what came next, included a conversation about shelter and winter preparation. The mood in the room was chastened. Men who had laughed about overstocking and free grass 6 months earlier were now counting dead cattle and wondering whether the open-range model would survive. Silas Hume spoke. He had earned his right to speak through 4 decades of watching Wyoming weather kill what ambition built, and the room listened to him the way rooms listen to men who have been right more often than they have been comfortable. He described Clara's method, the bench, the channels, the firebox, the heat retention. He described the lambing shed rescue. He described the fuel savings. He used the word efficient, which was not a word Silas used lightly or often. A man in the back of the room, a ranch foreman Clara had never met, said, "And who taught a girl to build a chimney that works backward?" The room shifted. Some men looked at their boots. Others looked at Elias because Elias was known. And what Elias was known for in this room was the wager he had made publicly, a month's wages that the girl on the creek would freeze to death. Elias stood. The chair scraped against the floor. The sound cut through the murmuring like a blade. He said, "I wagered on weather to prove her small." He paused. "It proved me one." He sat down. The room stayed quiet for a count of 10, the kind of silence that follows a sentence no one expected and no one can dismiss. Then the conversation moved on. The way frontier conversations move on from the things that matter most covering them with logistics and plans the way snow covers the scars on the land. But the admission hung in the air like smoke from a banked fire, visible, undeniable, and slow to clear. That was his conversion. Not a grand speech, not tears, not a man falling to his knees. A single sentence in a room full of men who had heard him mock a woman he had once called a town sparrow, spoken standing, in public, at direct cost to his pride. It was the most expensive sentence Elias Rourke had ever spoken, and he spoke it without looking at the floor. The courtship happened through labor. There is no other way to say it because there was no other way it happened. Elias came to the lean-to in August with a broken chimney section from a line shack his hands had built wrong. He set the cracked piece on the ground and asked Clara to show him where the build had failed. She picked up the section, turned it in her hands, and pointed to the inner seam where the clay had been packed too thin over a gap between two stones. Clara said, "The joint was not sealed. Heat found the gap and expanded the crack. Your man rushed the seam." Elias said, "Show me how to do it correctly." Clara handed him the trowel, Nora's trowel, the good one. She talked him through the butter and press technique Way had taught her. Thumb first into the gap, feeling for depth. Then the flat of the blade, pressing the clay in layers rather than a single smear. Scrape the excess. Press again. Check with the thumb. If the thumb finds air, the joint is not sealed. Elias was clumsy. His hands were large and calloused from rope and reins, not mortar and clay. He pressed too hard on the first pass and collapsed the edge of the seam. Clara did not fix it for him. She said, "Scrape it out, start over." He scraped it out. He started over. He worked the clay the way Clara told him to work it, slowly, with his thumb leading, pressing into the gap until the joint was flush. When he held the section up for her to inspect, she ran her thumb along the seam and found it tight. She said, "That will hold." He looked at her. Not the way he had looked at her in November, from horseback, through the lens of a certainty that had never been tested. A different look. The look of a man who has learned something from someone he once dismissed, and who is only now beginning to reckon with what that learning costs and what it gives. He came back the following week and helped lay the stone he had delivered. He worked beside Clara in the creek cut, setting channel walls for a bench she was building for a homesteader to the south. He ruined a firebox throat by setting the stones too wide. The opening gaped, and the draft would have been sluggish. Clara made him tear it out. He rebuilt it. He set the stones too narrow. Clara made him tear it out again. The third attempt held. Elias sat back on his heels and looked at the throat with clay drying on his hands and a streak of mud across his forehead, and Clara looked at it too, and neither of them said anything because the throat was right, and the rightness was its own statement. By September, he was riding to the lean-to most evenings after the ranch work was done. They worked until dark. They ate together sometimes, salt pork, biscuits, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, sitting on the bench while the last warmth of the day bled out of the sky and the first cool of evening came in off the basin. They talked about draft and flue height and channel dimensions and clay ratios and the behavior of heat in mass. And underneath all the talk about heat and mass and fire was the other warmth, the unnamed kind. The kind that builds between two people who have stopped pretending they are not building something between them. He asked her in October. They were standing in a half-finished bench trench at a widow's cabin with clay on both their hands and a cold wind pushing through the cottonwoods along the creek. Elias said, "Marry me." Clara said, "Not until you stand beside my right to teach anyone who asks. Not just your hands, not just your ranch. Anyone, small holders, widows, homesteaders, anyone." Elias said, "I have already stood there." Clara said, "Stand there again, in front of people who matter." He did. At the next cattlemen's gathering, Elias said publicly that any person in the basin who wanted Clara's instruction, small holder, widow, homesteader, regardless of their standing, could send word to the Crescent Bar, and she would come or send Nora. He said it standing. He said it without qualifiers. They married in November of 1887, 1 year after Clara had walked out of Buffalo with a trunk and a broken brick. The ceremony was small. Nora stood beside Clara, holding the good trowel because she had no flowers, and the trowel was worth more. Silas stood beside Elias, which said more about what the old foreman had come to respect than any speech he would ever make. The preacher was from Buffalo. The witnesses were ranch hands and widows, and a 12-year-old boy named Orrin who had once brought Clara coffee in a freezing lambing shed without being asked. The years moved the way heat moves through mass, slowly, steadily, with a warmth that outlasted the individual fires. Clara and Elias did not run the Crescent Bar the way his father had run it. They ran it smaller, tighter, with better sheltering for stock and people and less faith in the generosity of open range. The catastrophic winter had taught the basin what Clara had already known. You do not survive by assuming the cold will spare you. You survive by building against it before it arrives. By the spring of 1888, Clara and Nora had overseen bench builds for 11 cabins, 4 line shacks, 2 lambing sheds, and a cookhouse. The designs varied: full sleeping platforms, shorter warming walls, adapted versions for specific spaces. But the principle held constant in everyone: horizontal heat path, thermal mass, slow release, sleep on stored warmth, not chased flame. Clara kept a ledger, not of money, though she earned enough to replace her worn tools and buy proper materials, but of builds. Each entry listed the location, the bench dimensions, the channel layout, the flue height, and any notes about performance or problems. In the margin of the third page, in small, careful letters, she wrote a single name: Wei Jian. She did not explain the entry to anyone who looked at the ledger. It was not for them. A letter reached her in the summer of 1888, forwarded through 3 towns and a railroad office. Wei had died of a chest illness at the camp south of the Platte. The letter was written by Sung, the same Chinese cook Wei had helped survive the Norther in the Line Shack on Crazy Woman Creek. The letter was brief. It said Wei had spoken of a woman in Wyoming who understood how heat moves. It said he had been proud of the joints. Clara read the letter twice. She folded it and placed it inside her father's folding rule case, beside the brass hinge, where it fit like something that had always belonged there. She did not cry where anyone could see. That night, after Elias had gone to check the stock, she sat alone on the bench and pressed her palm against the clay and let the grief move through her the way heat moves through mass, slowly, completely, without wasting itself on the air. When their first son was born the following spring, she named him Jonah for her father. His middle name was Jian. Elias did not question the choice. He knew whose hands had taught Clara to hold the seams. The compressed years carried their own weather. Children grew up pressing their palms against warm clay. Nora married a freighter in 1890 and moved north, but she came back every autumn to check Clara's seams and argue about flue heights, the way old friends argue about things that mattered deeply to both of them and to no one else. Silas Hume retired from the Crescent Bar in 1891 and spent his last years in a cabin on the South Fork with a bench Clara had built for him, 7 feet long, single channel, simple and tight, the kind of bench a man who values efficiency and distrusts sentiment would choose. He died in his sleep on a February night, warm, on clay, with a fire that had been out for 3 hours, and a body that the cold did not reach in time. Clara heard the news and walked to his cabin and pressed her hand against the bench where he had lain, and the clay was still warm, and she stood there for a long time without speaking. Clara lived the rest of her life in northern Wyoming, not as the girl the town had spit out, but as a builder, the woman people sent for before first snow. Her later years were quieter than her beginning. The work outlasted the scandal that had started it. The benches outlasted the gossip. The principal outlasted everyone who had laughed at the mud. She taught until her hands grew too stiff to trowel, and then she taught by watching others trowel and correcting them with her voice, the same voice that had once said, to a deputy in the dark outside a stable, nothing at all. She kept the folding rule in her apron pocket until the brass hinge finally broke, and then she kept it on a shelf beside the ledger with Wei Jian's name in the margin and the letter folded inside. Within a few winters of Clara's first build, her bench and flue method had spread through a cluster of cabins and ranch outbuildings along the creek roads and line camps of the Powder River Basin. The frontier stole language as easily as it stole tools, and not every mouth that repeated the method attached her name to it. But widows, lambing hands, bunkhouse men, and small holders repeated the practical parts correctly. Keep the fire outside if you can. Make the heat travel before it rises, and sleep against the mass, not the flame. By 1890, Nora alone had overseen 14 builds. By 1900, the principal had moved beyond the basin into country Clara would never visit and lives she would never know. Clara Bell Mercer died in the winter of 1912, aged 45, on the bench in the house beside Crazy Woman Creek. She had fired it that evening the way she always did, a short, hot burn, willow and sage, the fuel pushed in and the damper closed. The bench was warm when she lay down. It was warm when she did not wake up. The morning they carried her out, her hand was resting on the clay, palm down, the way her father had once placed it on a bread oven wall in a river town 1,000 miles and a lifetime away. Elias Rourke had set it from horseback in November of 1886, loud enough for the hands and the wind and the whole indifferent basin to hear, "She means to sleep on a grave she built herself." The winter answered him. Not a grave, but a long clay bench warm under quilts, while stormlight whitened the doorway. Not a roaring fire, but stored heat radiating upward through the hours after the flame was gone. Not rescue, but design. On a spring morning, years later, a child in stocking feet, the youngest, a girl with her mother's hands, pressed her palm against sun-dried clay, still warm from the morning burn. While outside, the wind dragged snow along the fence wire exactly as it had the winter Elias rode out expecting to find a body. The clay held. The heat stayed. Clara Mercer had not built a grave. She had built the thing that remembers warmth after everyone else has let it go.